Welcome to the IDP Plus Advice Show. Today we're going to talk about my post NFL draft Dynasty offensive and IDP rookie draft board in the form of tiers, as I talked about in my last show. So that is the plan for today. You're probably not going to find that in too many other places where you have offense and IDP tiers and rankings together. And that's what we're going to do. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. All righty, it's good to be back with everyone again this week. I'm your host, Ricky Rodrigue. You can find me on X at RickyRod66, and I'm so glad to be here. Of course, a week or so ago, I took you through my groupings of 16 players in 5 groups, roughly 80 players that I was keeping an eye on, and that I've been watching and formulating to those groups throughout the year. And now we're doing a fine tuning of that with this week's show, where we put these into tiers, and it's draft tiers, and it's a prioritization / ranking tiers. So that's what we're going to be covering. Now, my thought process on this is that this is for deep leagues. So roughly, I have 101 players on this. We have 24 tiers plus one bonus tier, so 25 in total of my combined offense and IDP rookie rankings. On offense, you're going to see I have 52 and a half, with Hunter, of course, being the half, and which means I had 48 and a half on the IDP side. Now, though it's roughly 50-50, I didn't try and force fit it that way. And you also see there are more offensive players near the top of the board than IDP players. And doing this tiering, once the NFL draft is over with, obviously here are the types of things that are taken into consideration. Number one, the draft capital, which rounds are taken in. Number two, the depth charts that they are now a part of, and what that means for snaps and playing time. Number three, what I like to call my expected team narratives, how I think the teams will perform and what it might mean for their playing time and snaps and so forth based on the team itself. Number four could be schemes that they're falling into, such as for safeties. Does the defense run a single high? Do they run two high, like Vic Fangio's Philadelphia safeties, as one example? And number five is then, is there a potential that a team will trade for someone or sign some of the free agents that are out there on the street that they're waiting to get post the NFL draft so they wouldn't have an impact to their compensatory picks in next year's draft? So took all that into consideration in terms of building out these tiers. As I've typically done with this, it is a one quarterback thought process with a PPR, non-tight end premium. On IDP side of things, the 5 true positions, defensive tackle / interior defensive line being one, edge / defensive end / outside linebacker being 2, your off-ball linebackers as being 3, which is more your inside linebackers, your mics to linebackers, then cornerbacks and safeties as 4 and 5. Also, when I'm doing this, I'm taking into consideration IDP scoring systems that bring defense along the lines of offense from a scoring perspective, and even does positional bumps to make defensive tackles potentially more valuable cornerbacks. So that is taken into consideration as part of this. It also, as I talked about, this for deep leagues, and so it also assumes very, very deep rosters. So with that, I'm going to start flashing here the top of my draft board here. But just as I'm beginning to do that and adding that here to the screen, for those that may be listening on Spotify, you can go back to our YouTube channel, the IDP Plus YouTube channel, if you want to see the specific names and tiers as I kind of scroll through them as we're going through these various tiers. So keep that in mind as we're going through this. Um, as I mentioned last show, there weren't a whole lot of studs per se. If you think about last year's draft class versus this year's, when I did a written article for IDP Plus last year that covered this information, and I had 8 players in the stud category. And as you can already see on the screen, um, in the tier 1 and 1A, I only have a couple of what I'm considering studs this year. But this year there is a lot of depth. Now, depth is helpful for our dynasty teams, but not necessarily going to bring us championships. So as you're going through this, just keep that in mind. And if I was a competing dynasty team, and I mentioned this in my last show, and I had a chance to win the championships, I'm either aggressively trying to trade up for some folks in the first several tiers, or I'm looking to trade out either for veterans or maybe even draft picks next year. On the other hand, if I'm in rebuild mode, because there is a lot of depth, it gives you an opportunity to maybe with a lot of picks, maybe end up getting a few shots in the dark that you're actually successful with and hit. And as a result of that, it may be worth keeping a lot of picks this year. So before we start digging into the tiers and talking to the tiers specifically, I do have to do some promotional announcements. The first one is Fast Draft app. If you haven't tried it out yet, it's fantastic. It's a lot of fun. Get drafts done in like 6 minutes. It's awesome. They also have IDP, and they're doing a first time deposit match. So you could put up to $50 and get a $50 match with the code PLUS, PLUS, as in IDP plus. Get it? Okay, that's easy to remember. If you put in 10, they'll match 10, but you can go all the way up to $50. That's the first thing. Second thing, over at idpplus.com, biggest deal ever, 50% off. That promo ends on May 1st, which is just right around the corner from when you're probably listening or watching this. So IDP 2025 is that promo code, ends on May 1st. Lastly, I just want to put a quick plug in for the Fantasy Football Expo. That'll be held August 8th through the 10th in Canton, Ohio, the home of the Hall of Fame. It's the week after the Hall of Fame induction ceremony. When you're going to meet a lot of great people throughout the industry. It's a whole lot of fun. Check out the website the website is thefantasyfootballexpo.com. All righty, with that, let's start digging into our tiers, folks. And look, some of these, particularly at the beginning of this, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on. Um, Ashton Genty, for example, is tier 1. He is 1.1, whether it be flex, super flex, offense, and IDP, just offense, whatever it might be. He is the 1.1. Don't overthink it. Move forward with Ashton Genty. Okay. Now I have what I'm calling tier 1A, and that is Travis Hunter. The good news, too, with Jacksonville talking about the fact that they're going to start him out on the wide receiver side of things, that is great news for Travis Hunter, great news for us fantasy football players. So if he plays offense and you have scoring where he picks up additional points for maybe some cornerback stats, maybe a tackle, a few tackles, interceptions, pass defense, whatever it might be, extra bonus. If he's a cornerback that gets you some additional points from a wide receiver perspective, that's also awesome as well. So that would make him a true stud among all the cornerbacks. So Ashton Genty tier 1, Travis Hunter tier 1A. Let's move on to tier 2 here, folks. And as a side note, because of the 24 plus 1 tiers that I have, this could be a rather long show. If it starts running too long, I may just call it at some point and break it into 2 shows to make it easier for all of you to digest. Okay. Tier 2, Omarion Hampton, number 3 overall on the board, lands at the Chargers in a great fit. Don't need to overemphasize that. The only risk is this year, the Najee Harris impact. I do think the veteran deferral will happen, which means Hampton won't get as many points this year. Harris has also tended to be very healthy and shows up for every game, basically. So I think that's going to damper Hampton this year. But as we go into next year, he'll be getting 75, 80% of the snaps, doing something that the Chargers coaching staff, Jim Harbaugh and Roman, want to do, and that's run the freaking football. So we got Hampton leading off tier 2. Tedoro, Tedoro McMillan, who doesn't want to be called Tet, by the way. So he wants to be called either by his full name or T-Mac. So goes to Carolina Panthers. Expect him to be the number one in Carolina. What I expect from a depth chart perspective in Carolina in terms of how things will play out, and this is where I think draft capital will come into play. Uh, T Mac will start off at the X with Jalen Coker behind him. Okay, I expect Xavier Legette on the other side, and I expect Adam Thielen in the slot. That's how I think things are going to shake out to start here for the Carolina Panthers. So because Bryce Young is short and because T-Mac is tall, that certainly helps Bryce Young and helps him to build on what we started to see in the second half of the year. Travion Henderson to the Patriots is next on my board on tier 2. I love his landing spot in New England. Some people might be worried about Ramondre Stevenson. If you go back in time when Josh McDaniels was the OC in New England, he actually had Ramondre Stevenson early on in his career. I believe it was his first season. He didn't use Ramondre Stevenson that much. Ramondre Stevenson doesn't have the speed and explosion that clearly New England is making a move towards. So I think a lot of this bodes very poorly for Ramondre Stevenson. I would be looking to dump him pretty quickly. In fact, my prediction here on April 28th, as I record this, is that it'll be Travion Henderson number 1, Antonio Gibson number 2, Ramondre Stevenson on the outside looking in. That's how I see things going to be playing out. Now, does it maybe start the season that way? Maybe not, because the learning curve for Henderson and so forth. But the good news is Henderson is a pass blocker, but a very, very, very good pass blocker. And several coaches commented. In fact, I think Chris Ballard of the Colts even said something about Henderson and his pass blocking capabilities, even though they didn't draft him. But Stevenson may start the year at the number 1 spot just because of his contract. But by the mid-year time frame, it's Henderson, it's Gibson, and Stevenson is potentially even inactive. That's how Ricky Rod sees it. Okay. But by the way, he had 46 catches in the last couple of years. So in addition to being a good pass blocker, he can catch the ball. He has the speed on the outside. We saw what he did in the playoff game. Okay, enough about Henderson. Let's move on. R.J. Harvey with Denver is next on the list. Yes, I have him above Quinshon Judkins. Yes, I have him above Caleb Johnson. I think many of you that have been following me know, but in case you didn't, I'm from South Louisiana originally. I'm an LSU fan and I'm a New Orleans Saints fan. Watched Sean Payton for a lot of the years with the Saints and how he used Alvin Kamara in particular. Later on, Reggie Bush before that. R.J. Harvey's not going to get 260 carries. We know that. He's 5'9"-ish, about 205. Alvin Kamara is not exactly a 230-pound bulldozer either, and neither was Reggie Bush. So what I do expect for R.J. Harvey is that he will get, let's call it 180, 190 carries, average about 4.5 yards a carry, get about 6 rushing touchdowns, but then also expect him to get about 60, 70 catches and throw in a couple of touchdowns on top of that. That's how I see it him being used. Yeah, you see Estime in there periodically, you see McLaughlin anywhere in there, etc. I wouldn't be surprised if they sign another veteran running back, to be honest with you. But even with that, that's how I see Harvey being used. Now, I heard some people say, oh, he's a Darren Sproles. There's no way that Sean Payton used second-round draft capital for a Darren Sproles type. He used him for a Reggie Bush type. He used him for an Alvin Kamara type. So that is why I have Harvey ranked here. The one thing you need to consider, though, Harvey is 24 years old already. So for Dynasty folks who think that, when a running back hits 26, time to dump him, get rid of him, if that's truly your mindset and your thought process, consider that before you pick him, if that's really going to bother you. I'm not as worried about it because he did start off as a quarterback, transition to running back, hasn't had as many hits, etc. So that's R.J. Harvey. Next, Quinshon Judkins in Cleveland. Good physical inside runner, ran a surprising 4.48. I do expect like a 70 to 30% um, rush share, with 70% going to Judkins, even in this first year. With Jerome Ford getting the majority of that 30% earlier in the year, Sampson slowly being eased into it, and eventually Sampson supplanting Ford. We'll talk about Sampson a little bit later, but he is much further down my tier list, and you'll see that when we get to it, okay? But so that's Judkins. Now, Judkins is not a runner like Nick Chubb. Let's be really clear on that. And one of my concerns when I watch him is sometimes I've seen him and it feels like he runs into the back of his offensive line, and it has me worried about some of his vision. Now, maybe I saw a few exceptions that got me overly worried, but that is my concern. He's definitely not a Nick Chubb, but relative to the rest of the board and the rest of the players, he ranks right here in the middle of my tier two. But keep that break point in mind between Harvey and Judkins when we get to tier three, because I will make a comment on that. Next in my tier two, the only quarterback up here is Cam Ward. So I do expect Cam Ward to start for Tennessee, obviously. Not worried about Will Levis, even though it came out today that we had no intentions of trading Will Levis, and it's going to be a competition. Yeah, whatever. Okay. Nice coach speak kind of stuff and GM speak stuff. But Ward, he will give you yards with his legs, which is extremely promising. He's got a YOLO kind of mindset too, as well. Now, some of that they're going to try and rein in to try and, because some of the stuff he got away in college, he might not get away with the NFL. But with that YOLO kind of mindset, along with the rushing yards, I can see Cam Ward having a chance to finish in that 10, 11, 12 range, not year one, but as he moves forward. He does have some targets this year with Calvin Ridley and Tyler Lockett, although both are over 30 as a side note. And I believe Lockett's going on 33. He doesn't have much beyond that. So if there's some injuries, that could certainly impact him. One of the reasons I'm not high on him in year one in particular. It's nice also that they've put so much time and effort into their offensive line, moving Latham over to his more natural right tackle side from the left tackle slide with the signing of Moore that they did in free agency for left tackle. Even though he's not the greatest in the world, he's much better than Latham over there. So Tennessee did some nice stuff here. That's why I have Ward there. Colston Loveland is next on the list in tier two. Does he have an opportunity to be a Sam Laporta rookie tight end? I think the answer to that is yes. Now, the difference, though, and the one thing we have to worry about is, at least for year one, when you look at the Lions, it was Amon-Ra St. Brown number one, and then Laporta was really number two. In this particular case with the Bears, you're going to have DJ Moore and Roma Dunze sprinkled in with probably a little bit of Luther Burden, and you got a little bit Cole Kmet. So Loveland is someone that have him in tier two, love the long term. When Ben Johnson, the offensive guru, wants him and can imagine the many ways he's going to use him, absolutely want Loveland for Dynasty. Manage your expectations year one. And if he doesn't have a great year one, it's absolutely someone I would be trying to steal from whoever drafted him if that person is frustrated. All right, two more here in tier two. Caleb Johnson with the Steelers and Bashal Tutin with the Jaguars. Some people might be surprised I have these two folks, these players, before some of the other wide receivers and before some of the IDPs. But I do think Caleb Johnson takes on the Najee Harris role, which means probably 250, 260 carries, and hopefully he can do better than 4 yards a carry that Najee did. Okay, that's part of our hope, and hopefully, gosh, I hate to say this, but they do get another quarterback besides Mason Rudolph, and hopefully it is Aaron Rodgers, because I think Aaron Rodgers will be more effective than what we would have with Mason Rudolph, which would be much more beneficial for Caleb Johnson. And I do think over time, Jaylen Warren may not be re-signed this next year. And as a result, Caleb Johnson could have more of the ground game. Mike Tomlin even talked about his ability to carry such a heavy workload. So year two, I expect 300 carries out of Caleb Johnson, 250-ish this year. And if the Steelers offense does okay with an Aaron Rodgers type, enough touchdowns to make him very valuable and keep him in tier two. Bashal Tutin, He was a target of Jacksonville early on day 3. In fact, Gladstone mentioned in an interview, I didn't hear it, I just saw the notes from it. So I didn't hear it personally, but what the notes said was that Tootin was talked about by Gladstone during his interview for the GM role for Jacksonville, and how much he liked him and what was going to be a target for him, and he brought it in. And Etienne's going to be a free agent after the end of this year. Bigsby did have a couple of big runs this past year, but other than that, he didn't really do a whole lot. So I can see Tootin end up being the platoon with Etienne this year, with Bigsby maybe getting a few snaps here and there, and Tootin taking over next year when they realize Bigsby's not worth anything. And remember, it's a new regime that didn't draft Bigsby, and Etienne leaves in free agency. So that's why I have him this high. I think there's huge opportunities for Tootin, and even at 210 pounds roughly, but with his speed and with Brian Thomas and a Travis Hunter and a Brent Strange and so forth, I see good opportunities for Tootin in this whole offense overall. Okay, so that is my tier 2, and we're going to move on to tier 3, and now you're going to start seeing some IDPs as we move into tier 3, folks. So let me scroll up, and for those on the screen, you see a couple in orange. Um, I actually call this tier my IDP studs with a couple of caveats. So obviously Abdul Carter is number 1. And once again, if you go back to the scoring comments that I made at the beginning of this podcast here, one of the things I mentioned is how I do boost up IDP scoring in my thought process. And usually when that happens, it means there's big points for sacks and tackle for losses and so forth. And that puts Abdul Carter absolutely at the top of the list. And for those that have been playing IDP for a long time, I think that as we move forward, when you're talking about the top edge players like we are today, the Myles Garretts, the Nick Boses, the TJ Watts as examples, you're going to hear Abdul Carter mentioned with those names and the Micah Parsons and the Will Andersons. Okay. Now, I said that in the middle of tier 2 when I was talking about the RJ Harvey range around the Quinshon Judkins, I actually would put some of these IDPs actually right after RJ Harvey. But because in general there's this bias, even in combined offense and IDP leagues, to it lends itself towards more an offensive drafting bias. That's why I have these guys in tier 3. Otherwise, um, several of them would be in that middle of tier 2 range. And if your specific leagues draft that way, where they do balance IDPs more with offense in the drafting, particularly the rookie drafting, I would move these folks to the middle of tier 2. Okay. So that's Abdul Carter in the tangent that I said I was going to come back to related to where these IDPs could be from a tiering perspective. Okay. Remember, I called this my IDP studs with a couple of caveats. And for those that are able to see the screen or looking at it, they'll see that Jahad Campbell and Jalen Walker are both color coded in orange. The reason for that is quite simple. The reason is what is going to be their designation in various uh, league settings on the different forums that you may play on, whether it be ESPN, whether it be My Fantasy League, whether it be Sleeper, etc. That's going to be very critical, number 1. Number 2 will be how will these 2 players get used? So let's start with Jalen Walker. When Jalen Walker was drafted, he was announced as an edge. And so right there is like, because I would have loved to have seen him more as an as reference as a linebacker as opposed to an edge. Okay. And have him play that off-ball linebacker role where he'd get tackles, but then he could also blitz from the middle or periodically blitz from the edge and add the sacks, and that would make him extremely valuable. But as an edge, I don't feel as good about him. I think he has a decent sized learning curve, and I know that he was the rave of a lot of draft analysts, but he's 6'1", so he's not very tall for an edge person. He's 245. He kind of ran into some sacks as opposed to creating the sacks on a couple of them that I saw on the videos. It makes me nervous. So So that's the thing with Jalen Walker. Same thing with Jahad Campbell. He would the Eagles talked about him after the draft as being sort of positionless, which means he could play maybe an off-ball linebacker role, or he may play on the edge, or he may play both. He would have a better chance right now in Philadelphia of playing on the edge with a lot of the players that they lost, such as Brandon Graham to retirement, such as Josh Sweat in free agency to Arizona. So he had more opportunity on the edge. On the inside, they have Zach Bond. Now, Nakobe Dean is on injured reserve, so he would have an opportunity to play there as well. Um, so what's going to happen with Campbell? What's going to happen with Walker? Boy, if they play that off-ball linebacker position, they could get so many tackles in the middle there, plus add some blitzing and add some sacks, and then that kind of scoring could be really great. We're just going to have to watch as this moves on, how they're ultimately being used, and that'll have an impact. I know that doesn't help you for your drafts. If I'm a betting person, I'm taking Campbell over Walker because I think with Walker, even with the drafting of Pierce, he's going to play more on the edge because of the noise they made about drafting and need to improve their rush and blah blah blah. And so I think Walker gets designated at edge, plays on the edge, doesn't get as many tackles, doesn't get as many sacks. So I like Campbell way more than Walker in that kind of scenario right now. But depending on what else was on the board, I might go with Walker as well. The last one in this tier 3, Carson Schlesinger with Cleveland. Okay, so let's talk about the depth chart in Cleveland. Depth chart has Jordan Hicks, who's 32, 33 right now and very injury prone. You have JOK, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, who has a neck injury, who, yes, he did show up to the off-season, whatever you call this latest thing that they did. There is no reports of him, being healthy or anything along those. He just showed up. So don't read too much into him just showing up. Until they say, and they haven't come close to saying anything, they being Cleveland, that JOK is cleared to play and he's healthy and he's all fine. Right now, my gut is leaning towards he might not be able to play at all in 2025. And as a result of that, and with Hicks' situation and other competitors being Devin Bush for playing time, Schlesinger's in a real sweet spot to play a Mike linebacker role for Cleveland and get a ton of tackles. This is a man that got 136 tackles at UCLA last year in his first year starting as off-ball linebacker. So Schlesinger, tier 3, those are my top 4 IDPs. Let's move to tier number 4. This is the tier I'm calling the top pass catchers that I see becoming team number 2s in targets in the next year or two, meaning not necessarily this year. So Emeka Egbuka going to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard potentially because he's a favorite of Baker Mayfield. Okay, there's 4, and then you add Egbuka to the mix. This year, everybody's saying, "Oh, this must mean Godwin's not going to play this year, or he's behind on his recovery or his rehab." Not buying that because not just a few weeks ago it was reported that that was not an issue and he was on track with his schedule. Will he be up there week 1? Maybe not. Week 3, week 4, worst case probably for Godwin, which means Egbuka not so much this year. Next year though, Mike Evans, 32 this year, last year of his contract. They could be looking ahead, 1 year ahead. Plus, now Evans has had some injuries the past couple of years and missed several games. So, and that's part of the reason they did draft Egbuka. They even mentioned that in one of the conferences, but still not enough for Egbuka to have a lot of value this year, but someone to target for the future. Jaden Higgins with the Houston Texans next here in tier 4. Big, strong, contested catcher, much faster at the combine than expected. He had comps to Nico Collins. He ends up on the same team with Nico Collins. So even though Houston really didn't draft much to help their offensive line at all, which has me concerned, they have put in more effort into additional targets for CJ Stroud this year, which includes Higgins, which includes Christian Kirk, which includes Jalen Noel, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Higgins can grow to be that number 2 wide receiver in Houston. Collins clearly number 1, Higgins number 2. That's why I have him in tier 4. And lastly, Tyler Warren. Great for pro football purposes that he ended up with the Indianapolis Colts. They absolutely needed a tight end. But the quarterbacks this year are Daniel Jones and Anthony Richardson. And that gives me a whole heck of a lot of pause. Remember, I talked earlier about my criteria that I thought through when I was putting people into these tiers. And we've seen a lot of good players through the years who ended up in horrible situations and never fully, their upside never fully materialized on those teams. And I am really worried about that for Tyler Warren. There's Michael Pittman. There's Josh Downs, who also plays on the slot on the inside. There's Alec Pierce / Adonai Mitchell. But more importantly, there's Daniel Jones and or Anthony Richardson throwing the ball. I believe Anthony Richardson starts the year. His percentage completion improves from, say, 48 to 54, 55%. Eventually gets benched for Daniel Jones, who didn't use the tight ends a lot in the past in New York necessarily, with Daniel Bellinger like a leading tight end with like 35 or 38 catches, something along those lines. Okay. So I'm worried about Warren. I'm willing to take him here because of his capabilities and skill sets. And maybe in year 2 or year 3, there's different quarterbacks in Indianapolis, or maybe Jones and Richardson surprise and really take off. So I'm going to take him here, but with a lot of caution and maybe even a lot of heartburn. Okay. Let's go to tier 5, where I have 2 wide receivers. I call this my top pass catchers in less than ideal situations in 2025. And not only that, I don't see him becoming the team's number 1 and number 2 target in the next couple of years. But I do like their skills, and that's Matthew Golden and Luther Burden. When you look at Golden going to Green Bay, granted Christian Watson, I know, is hurt this year, and it is year 4 from a contract perspective for him. So he is a free agent going to next year, but he should be back roughly the middle of this year. Then you have Jaden Reed. You have Romeo Dobbs. You have Dontavian Wicks. By the way, Dontavian Wicks truthers really feel bad for you at this point in time. Tucker Kraft, Luke Musgrave. You've got those 2 at the tight end spot. They also drafted Savion Williams from a gadget perspective. Matt LaFleur isn't afraid to throw screen passes to the Josh Jacobs of the world, and whether it be Marshawn Lloyd or Emmanuel Wilson from running back perspective. There's just a lot of different mouths to feed. I did like Golden. I never saw him as a potential number 1 wide receiver, as you might have seen a Malik Neighbors or a Brian Thomas or a Ladd McConkey last year. I still don't see that out of Golden. So with all the mouths and all, granted he is talented, a lot can change in a couple of years, but for now, that's why I have him down in tier 5. Luther Burden, similarly, I alluded to it when we're talking about Loveland back up in tier 2. But there's Loveland, there's Cole Kmet currently, there's DJ Moore, there's Roma Dunze, there's DeAndre Swift out of the backfield. There's a lot of different mouths to field. And Caleb Williams is still in year 2. Do I think they'll scheme up some occasional screens and a few plays for Burden? Absolutely. But do I see him in the next couple of years become number 1, number 2? Not unless they do something with DJ Moore or Dunze. And I do have confidence in Odunze. He didn't do that bad. He still had over 50 catches this past year, folks, and had a lot of red zone targets that didn't materialize in many touchdowns, but he was a target, and I see more of that happening this year. So Golden and Burden, that's why I have them slipping in tier 5. That's why I have them behind the ones that I had in tier 4 that I just covered. Okay, so that takes us through tier 5, and let's continue down into the next tiers. And we've got a combination of offense coming up and then some more IDPs. So let's start with tier 6 and get into some more wide receivers and tight ends and pass catchers. This one, let's start with Trey Harris. Trey Harris was a 5th-year senior not seen as a great separator, but seen as with strong catch skills, strong contested catch skills, a big X type of receiver. Okay, he did run a limited route tree at Ole Miss. Doesn't mean he's not capable of it, but just that Ole Miss offense, that's just the way it was. By the way, that has impacts to Tier 7 in Jackson Dart, and why I have him a little bit further down than we had uh, Cam Ward, who I talked about a little bit earlier. So I do see Trey Harris actually moving to the number 2 slot ahead of Quentin Johnston. So absolutely see that playing out that way. And remember, they did sign Mike Williams. Now, Mike Williams is 30, so I'm not losing a lot of sleep over that. But I think Trey Harris with Quentin Johnston continue to show those inconsistent hands. Yes, he had a better year, but I see Harris overtaking Quentin Johnston potentially as early as the first week of the season, folks. So that's why I feel good about him. That's why I have him here in this Tier 6. Jack Besh uh, started at LSU, moved on to TCU. His breakout year was really this year at TCU, where he had 62 catches and averaged almost 17 yards a catch. It was like 16.7 yards per catch. Strong physical blocker. He didn't run the 40. There are some speed concerns, but he is a good route runner. Now, there's a lot of people trying to comp him to Puka Nacua. I know the Raiders hope that he turns out that way. But um, if he does, fantastic. I don't have that much faith in him. Otherwise, if I did, I'd have him much higher. But he should be a starter right away. Right now, the starting wide receivers for the Las Vegas Raiders would be Jacoby Myers, Jack Besh, with Trey Tucker sprinkled in. Of course, the number one receiver is the quote tight end, Brock Bowers. But so Besh has, though, in the next, depending on what happens with Jacoby Myers, Besh could be the number 2 target monster in Las Vegas next year. So that's why I like him. That's why we have him here in Tier 6. Moving on, Mason Taylor. Mason Taylor should jump right to the front of the line in front of Jeremy Ruckert and Stone Smart as the starting tight end for the New York Jets. He also has a chance to be the number 2 target hog, let's just call it that, for the Jets behind Garrett Wilson at wide receiver. Josh Reynolds, Alan Lazard, Malachi Corley, that's the other receivers we're talking about with the Jets, folks. So I can see Mason Taylor potentially having the best chance to duplicate what Laporta did. The only reason I have him this far down and not as high up is because we have Justin Fields at quarterback, not a Jared Goff as Laporta had. And with Justin Fields running a new system and a system that's probably going to try and run the ball, similar to what we saw at Detroit with a David Montgomery and a Jahmyr Gibbs, you see a lot of Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. So I think the number of pass attempts will be down. That's the only reason I don't have Mason Taylor in that similar Sam Laporta kind of mindset. But I do love Taylor a lot. And as a side note, this man is clutch. Okay. I think most people know he's Jason Taylor, the Hall of Famer's son. Got it. But against Alabama as a freshman, 31-30 in overtime, LSU scores a touchdown down by 1. Brian Kelly, big football. Brian Kelly decides to go to 2 to either win it or lose it. Who does Jaden Daniels throw to? He throws it to Mason Taylor, who catches it as a freshman, secures it, sneaks it inside the pylon. He's clutch. Against Ole Miss in another drive, when LSU was behind late in the fourth quarter with less than a minute to go, caught a couple of big catches, knew to get out of bounds as well with no timeouts left. Did a fantastic job. Love Mason Taylor. Okay. Right behind him, though, Elijah Arroyo. This guy is extremely fast. He may even end up playing some X wide receiver, folks. That's one of the reasons I do have him this high. They do have Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Now, what's to know about MVS and where all this comes into play? Clint Kubiak was the offensive coordinator with the Saints last year. They signed MVS mid-season after Buffalo released him. And you probably recall how they used him on a lot of deep targets and how successful that was. Kubiak can scheme MVS for some long scores with Seattle. Why are you saying that? What's that all mean, Ricky, and related to Arroyo? If Arroyo gets some of those snaps and plays in that same type of role, or if Kubiak schemes him up similarly out of a tight end type of role, Arroyo could have some big plays and a lot of scoring, could add some significant value even in year one. And remember, you got Cooper Kupp and JSN, Jackson Smith and Jigba as the other two wide receivers. They're not exactly the deep threats uh, that a Arroyo is going to be with his speed. I believe it was 4.48 he ran. Don't quote me on that, but he led all FBS tight ends in yards per catch last year at almost 17. So, I take it back. Arroyo didn't have a 40-yard time, but you could see it on the field how fast he was and how as he was being chased, he was just pulling away from other defensive backs. Granted, it was college, but still. So he's got to work on his blocking. He showed a little bit of a willingness to block, but love Arroyo, have him here in tier 6. The last one might be a surprise as well. Some of you might think this is my New Orleans Saints bias. I'll call it out. You can make that determination, but it's Pat Bryant is the last one I have here in tier 6 with the Denver Broncos. Okay. He wasn't drafted in the same round as a Michael Thomas. Sean Payton, his press conference, alluded to him as having Michael Thomas traits. He didn't, and he even called out, look, I'm not trying to put pressure on him saying he's like Michael Thomas and he's going to catch over 100 balls like Michael Thomas. But if that's how Sean Payton is going to use him, similar to how he used Marquez Colston, who wasn't extremely fast. By the way, Pat Bryant wasn't extremely fast. He ran a 4.61 40. So, but Marquez Colston, who was a 7th-round draft pick for the Saints, was a tight end converted to this big slot wide receiver, kind of same role Michael Thomas played. I love this for Pat Bryant. And he was he was much, much further down my groupings that I shared in the last show, but I have bumped him up significantly based on his draft capital, based on the landing spot, based on the scheme, based on how I expect him to be used. So yes, Devon Vele kind of played that role some. Vele was 25, turned 26, I think, as a rookie last year, so he'd be 26 going to 27 this year. Marvin Mims is, going to be more this gadget guy. I can really see Pat Bryant get used, and as his experience improved more and more and more. So love me some Pat Bryant here in tier 6. Okay, tier 7. Jackson Dart's the only one I have in there at quarterback, the quarterback for the Giants. On the one hand, if the Giants struggle this year, he could get on the field late in the game, late in the year, which I wouldn't mind seeing. But at the same time, if they're doing okay and with some of they did a pretty decent job overall, folks. They could, if they have some health history and if the health luck versus their past health history, and if that offensive line holds up, they have a chance to be in the wild card fight this year. And if that's the case, Dart doesn't play. We see Wilson playing primarily this year. If that doesn't happen, then Dart gets in a few 3-4 games. I worry about that Ole Miss system. I worry about how long it might take him to get up to speed and all. This could be potentially a 2-year thing for him. That's why I have him all the way down here at tier 7. Okay, that's Jackson Dart. Let's move to tier 8 and tier 9, where we're going to talk about some IDPs. And we're going to talk about what I'm calling in this tier potential stud IDP edges, though they have some warts, and pick your favorite flavor. And I've got a safety thrown in here as well. Okay, so Donovan Izuruku. Look, I don't work for SiriusXM, folks, so if I did, I'd spend more time learning how to pronounce all these names appropriately, but I don't get paid by SiriusXM, so bear with me on some of the pronunciations. Okay, look, Donovan has a lot of pass rush moves. He'll be across from Micah Parsons on the other edge, which is great. Okay, what warts does he have? He's only 6'3". He does have long arms and wingspan. The other thing I love about him, he had 80 tackles last year, 80 as an edge player, with 20 and a half of those being tackles for loss, 16 and a half sacks, and 3/4 fumbles at Boston College. Okay, so, and once again, this wasn't like one of the non-Power 4 conferences, that he was playing in. So lots of good stuff. I do worry about his shorter side, being able to hold up against the rush until he gets more bulk. He does have a lot of pass rushing moves as well. So love for his pass rushing. And once again, scoring system's a key here. If you get big scoring for sacks and all, absolutely love him. And as he puts on more weight and strength over the next couple of years, love him even more. He's just short, and that is a little bit of a risk. Okay. Next, James Pierce Jr. demonstrated great speed, demonstrated great power, does need to work on his technique some. Some of the stuff that I watched and some of the analysts comment on the fact is, does he really want to set the edge against the run? Was he interested in trying to stop the run at all? And was he really mostly interested in just trying to get in the backfield and trying to shoot for tackles for loss and sacks? There's also this word about, is he coachable? Now, supposedly the day before the draft, there was a secret meeting between the Falcons and Pierce and his mom, got them comfortable enough to make that massive trade where they gave away the farm, and the Rams certainly benefited from that. So um, that's that's the concerns with Pierce. He did have 38 tackles, 13 tackles for loss, and 7.5 sacks last year. 38 very different from 80, but 80 is like a true outlier for an edge that Izuruku had. So, but boy, he likes to shoot back in there, and so he kind of plays. I'd call it undisciplined as well. Can the Falcons hone that in? And hopefully they can. But that's what some of these concerns. That's why these guys that we're talking about, these edge players in Tier 8, aren't in that earlier Tier 3 IDP edge group that I had. Shamar Stewart, another one with a bunch of questions, going to the Cincinnati Bengals. Incredible athlete with limited production. Only 31 tackles, only 5.5 tackles for loss, only 1.5 sacks last year. Now, the one good thing is that he had 39 pressures. I also saw a stat that he had a huge missed tackle rate. So with some good coaching in Cincinnati, and Al Golden comes from Notre Dame, comes from the college background where a lot of teaching had to be done, that gives hope that there can be some good coaching for him. And it's not that he didn't play hard either. He did play hard as well, by the way. The question will be, is he someone that looks like Tarzan and plays like Jane? Or does he look like Tarzan and can they mold him into a true Tarzan type of player? That also applies to our next person, Michael Williams, who truly looks the part. Massive, huge wingspan, but once again, someone with limited production. He played with an ankle injury. Georgia did rotate their line a little bit more, but he only had 21 tackles this past year, 8.5 tackles for loss. He did have 5 sacks, but 4 came against the Texas Longhorns. So outside of that, didn't really do anything from a sack perspective. Let me rephrase that. I could see him easily setting the edge from a stopping the run perspective with his big hulking self that he is. But can San Francisco convert him to a major pass rusher? That's the wart that I'm worried about with Michael Williams. So those 4 edge folks in this Tier 8 could easily potentially be Tier 3 worthy with Abdul Carters of the world that I talked about earlier. But those are the warts that they need to work through. Now, I did mention I have one other safety, or one safety, I should say, in this group, and Seattle Seahawks traded up for him, Nick Emanuori, which, by the way, is very bad news for Kobe Bryant for those that benefit from him in that free safety role and the interceptions he had last year. I think he goes to the bench, becomes a third safety. Emanuori moves in there to start with Julian Love. Okay, just a quick IDP loser, Kobe Bryant for Seattle. Okay, he lost it because of this in the draft. Emanuori makes big plays. He's fast. He's physical. Does need to clean up tackling. He did have missed tackles, but boy, he could be another Kyle Hamilton in this Mike McDonald defensive system. If McDonald uses him like Hamilton, Amanwari, you could have argued should be in that Tier 3 that I talked about earlier with Abdul Carters and the Jihad Campbells of the world. That's how good he could be. Now, safeties, another reason is a lot of people say, well, safety is a dime a dozen. You can always find safeties. Yes, you can always find safeties usually put in your lineup. It doesn't mean they're high scoring safeties. This guy could be a top 5 for several years. Love him. And I think he will do extremely well with McDonald in Seattle. And Tier 8 is probably on the low side for him. Okay, let's move into Tier 9, folks. Oluwafemi Oladejo from Tennessee. Didn't do too bad on that one. I've heard him called Olu. I've heard him called Femi. Pick your what you desire. But Oladejo started off as a Mike slash inside linebacker for UCLA, and only in the middle of a year before last, they started moving him to the edge. And so he is just beginning to learn the edge. And so he has some good traits. He has the long arms and the wingspans. He did demonstrate good bend. He did have 17 and a half sacks, most of that being that last year and a half. Technically, it was the 2 years, but mostly when he moved to the edge. There's a lot to like him with him from an upside perspective. And from a playing time perspective, you might have heard they released Harold Landry. They did sign Draymond Jones, but he'd be competing against Draymond Jones and Arden Key from a starting edge perspective. Love Oladejo, love his upside. Okay. Another tough name to say is next. Princely Umanamillion, who played at Ole Miss most recently, Florida before that. I'm going to group him together with Nick Scorton for the Carolina Panthers. Scorton, of course, played at Texas A&M. Two more guys that have huge upside on PFF. And so when I do use PFF, I like to mention it. They had a scoring system that came out that has Princely much higher and suggested he should be picked much higher because he projects very well from an NFL productivity perspective. I'm not willing to go there with that numbers analysis that was done, but it is something definitely to keep in mind. Now, in both cases, both these gentlemen have upside. With Scorton, he had, when he was at Purdue in 23, he had 10 sacks. When he went to Texas A&M, who played a little bit more of a 3-4, some 4-3 and all, which I think also might have hurt Shamar Stewart as a side note, who we talked about in the previous tier. But I think that hurt Scorton, and he also beefed up to the 285-pound range. The word is now that he has come back down to that 255, 260 range that he played with at Purdue, which is good. Now, he's not the athlete that Shamar Stewart is, or some of these others we talked about, but he too has one heck of a motor, and he's a hard worker and all. He had 29 tackles for loss in his last 23 games between Purdue and Texas A&M, to put that in perspective as well. So he only had 5 sacks in 2024, but I think taking that weight off, being used more in this 3-4 scheme, more as an edge player as opposed to an interior player at Carolina, could bode well for him. Now, the problem for both Princely and Scorton, both, the depth chart. Let's talk about that. Who would have thought we'd be seeing that with Carolina? But they have Jadeveon Clowney, they have DJ Wynham, they signed Patrick Jones. They have those two, and then they have DJ Johnson, who was a draft pick of was it last year, year before? Sorry. So they have 6 potential edges. Not really worried about Johnson. Clowney's 32, and on a rebuilding team, there's talk in the last 24 hours that they're going to try and trade Clowney or may release him to give him a chance to go to a team that has a chance maybe to get to the playoffs in the Super Bowl, given his age. But we'll see how that plays out. But that hasn't happened yet. Clowney's from the Carolina region and may not want to leave and might be happy to stay there. Now, is Wonnum and Patrick Jones something to get overly nervous about? They're not exactly studs. They're guys. They're players. They do get some stats. Patrick Jones is overrated. Wonnum was overrated. Both came from Minnesota, had terrible pass rush win rates, but lucked into some sacks, for lack of a better term, which I think overvalued them. So I don't think they stand in the way either very much. So over time, I'm not worried about those folks staying in the way of Scorton and Princely, and that's why I have them at tier 9. But I don't think they're quite to the level with the upside of the ones in tier 8. All righty, let's move to tier 10, folks. And tier 10 is what I'm calling, at this point in the rookie draft and rankings, the highest upside, but the biggest risk potential. And I have 3 players in this category. The first one is Jalen Milroe. Extremely athletic, has the opportunity to learn behind Sam Darnold. I don't think McDonald is at risk anytime soon of losing his job. So that gives plenty of time for consistency. I do like Kubiak as an offensive coordinator as well. So you could argue that, and I think it's an easy argument, that Jalen Milroe has the highest dynasty ceiling of all rookie quarterbacks. You could also argue that he has one of the lowest floors. You could also argue that after 2 years, if it's just not coming together for him, he gets used as a Taysom Hill type of talent. So there's a lot to like about Milroe, and he's someone around this point of the draft, even ahead of some of the other running backs we haven't gotten to yet, that I would definitely take. And you'll hear my logic on some of those running backs and wide receivers and others here in a little bit as to why. The next one in this tier with a lot of risk, Mike Green. Mike Green was seen as a top 15 talent out of Marshall. In 2024, he had 22 and a half tackles for loss, 17 for sacks at Marshall. Make it, the problem with Mike Green, there was 2 sexual assault allegations. Charges were never brought up. He proactively brought it up as if he wasn't concerned about it. But you got to think, if the NFL let someone of his talent, a top 15 talent, fall all the way to number 59 to the Ravens, and at 59 with the Ravens, in their needs for pass rushing, he is worth the gamble at that point in time. But it is truly a gamble. So that's why I don't have him as high. I'd rather take a chance on some of the tier 9s that we just talked about because of that risk. But if we're now at this stage and those others off the board, I'm now taking my chance on Mike Green. A side note, Mike Green does have Odafe Owe and Kyle Van Noy ahead of him, so he's not going to be expected to start right away. And he did accumulate these stats at Marshall. Now, Marshall did play a couple of Power 4 teams and so forth, but I still think there's going to be a transition period for him against some of the bigger boys in the NFL. And as a result, don't expect immediate results from Green as well. Isaiah Bond did not get drafted. He's out on bond, if I understand correctly, because of the allegations, and he was arrested against him. He's also countersued. His lawyer did send an email, or maybe it was Bond sent it directly to all 32 teams, but his lawyer helped him craft or whatever, saying, hey, I'm innocent. But it shows you that through 7 rounds and 257, I believe it was, players being picked, no one was willing to take the chance on him. Now, he is a 4.37 40-yard dash guy, but he's only 5'10", 180 pounds. He does need to play stronger. He did have an ankle injury that impacted some of his stats. He's a potential boomer bust wide receiver on the field, and obviously there's these off-field risks as well. So around this time, though, and based on some of the other options, this is where I'm willing to take the risk on him. Okay, let's move to tier 11, folks. And we're going to go to both tier 11 and tier 12 and start getting into tier 13 as well. And tier 11 is what I'm calling the foreseeable committee running backs, number 2s. Could be at number 1 if the starter is injured. So let's start with Cam Scatterbo. A lot of people have him a lot higher, and I get it, and I understand why. I personally think, and this is Ricky Rod's opinion, you may not agree, and that's fine if you don't, okay? I think in New York, in year 1, it's going to be a 3-headed monster between Tracy and Singletary and Scatterbo. I still think Singletary is going to get a little bit of run because Tracy had fumbling problems, and I don't think he'll correct all of that in year 1 because of the fact that, as we saw in Hard Knocks, the spring edition, they let Barkley go. They were comfortable signing Singletary that he could fill in for him. So Joe Shane is going to have to save face a little bit on that. And then there'll be Scatterbo as well. So I think it'll be some sort of 3-head monster. Now, Scatterbo does have some fumble concerns as well. The thing I worry about, and the reason I have him all the way down at tier 11, though, the biggest thing is he seeks contact. He goes with this battering ram approach. He doesn't have tons of agility. And so he'd rather seek the contact and try and run over the guy as opposed to try and run around him. I think injuries are going to catch up with him. And that's why I'm not willing to risk a draft pick earlier, and I will take I would pick him much later as a result, all the way here in tier 11. and I'd take the chances on the Milroe and the Mike Greens as an example before him. Next, Jaden Blue. He is just too small to be a bell cow, folks. Good change of pace back. Maybe he gets a series or two, some scripted things. Remember Cavante Turpin, how they used him in the slot? Maybe Blue gets a couple of snaps in the slot, but I think there's some more manufactured stuff. Now, Blue also did a lot of fumbles. Had fumbles, and there's concern about how he holds the ball. And once again, another one that we have to watch for the fumble risk, and he'll have to learn to protect the ball better. On top of that, they also have Phil Maffa. I listened to Jerry Jones and Stephen Jones in um, Schottenheimer this afternoon before I've recorded this, and they talked about they like Javonte Williams, they like Miles Sanders, they like Blue, they like Phil Maffa, who they grabbed slash drafted in the 7th round, who is the other side of Blue. Blue's the little small guy, and Maffa's the probably too big of a guy. And so it's just a mishmash for the Cowboys. And they could still sign a free agent if they get into training camp if they're not happy with any of these folks. Or there could be a running back that gets dropped and waived at final cuts that they get and signed to the team. I just don't think Blue is someone that is worth picking that high just because there's this perception that he could move into the number 1 slot or the number 2 slot because of Javonte Williams and Miles Sanders. Just don't see it, folks. And then lastly in this tier is Woody Marks, who I was shocked that Houston traded up for him, particularly in the 3rd round, if I remember correctly. And I got my tiers 11 and tier 12 mixed up, and my apologies for that. Blue is in tier 12. Marks is in tier 12. Let me go back to tier 11, folks. DJ Giddens, and my apologies for that. DJ Giddens is in there along with Jarquez Hunter, along with Scattaboo. Giddens is a handcuff for Jonathan Taylor. Taylor, if you remember back in Wisconsin, never missed a game. Early on, he bragged about, I never missed a game in the Colts. Well, what started happening? All those carries started catching up. And yes, he did have some injuries and he did miss some games. So when Taylor is out, Giddens probably becomes a number 2, not a number 1 running back. Does that for the couple of games that Taylor's out. Then he goes back to the bench, and Taylor gets his 325 carries or so a year, give or take. So that's how I see the Colts thing playing out. That's why I have him all the way down here in tier 11. And Taylor just signed that long-term deal, so he's not going anywhere anytime soon as well. Jarquez Hunter with the Rams. So the Rams had him targeted for day 3. Interesting. He ended up being the top offensive player on their board when they got to day 3. So they obviously went ahead and picked him. But there's still Kyron Williams ahead of him. There's still Blake Corum, but they do like Hunter a lot. Okay. So Kyron Williams, there was talk a month or so ago that they were trying to sign him to an extension. That still hasn't happened yet. Blake Corum, of course, didn't do much last year because not sure why. Did they not trust him? Was Kyron Williams doing so well that they stuck with Kyron Williams? And then, of course, Corum hurt his shoulder later in the year. Can Hunter surpass Corum? Well, from a draft capital perspective, you could argue maybe not. Corum was a 3rd-round pick. Hunter was a 4th-round pick. Kyron Williams is still their bell cow. However, going into the draft right now, and without Williams having signed a long-term contract, and one of the biggest things that people have said about the Rams and their concerns about the Rams, Kyron Williams, is 1, he doesn't have a lot of explosive runs, and 2, he has fumbling problems. You've heard me talk about a lot of fumbling problems here in this episode, and it really is important. There is a chance that Hunter leapfrogs Corum when Kyron Williams potentially leaves in free agency if he doesn't get signed to an extension. That could potentially play out. The way I'm playing this is I'm probably not drafting Hunter unless I have Kyron Williams, and I'm trying to draft Hunter almost as a handcuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to let somebody else take him. So sorry if that was a little bit long-winded an explanation there, as several of these have probably been, but that's how I see this Rams backfield shaking out. I do think Williams ends up signing an extension. I do think that over time, though, either Corum or Hunter does surpass him during that extension time period. Okay, let's go back to number 12 that I skipped ahead of. I talked about Jaden Ballou. I started on Woody Marks. Let me go back to Marks. Once again, shocked that the Texans traded up for him, particularly into the third round. They must truly love his pass catching capability. With the concerns of the offensive line and his pass blocking capability as a running back, they must truly love that and feel that they want that instead of Joe Mixon in there, instead of Dore Ogunbowale in there. They want him to play that role. So that's probably good from a pass catching perspective. Joe Mixon, though, I still think this year Mixon ends up in the 250, 260 carry range, which doesn't leave a lot of the meat on the bone for Marks. I do think if Mixon needs a break, you may still even see Damian Pierce in there ahead of Marks, with Marks truly playing more of that third down role. Occasional, maybe you got himself first or second down carry, but not a whole lot. James White type of situation, 60 to 70 catches a year. So there's some games that he does really well for you, and he might even grab a touchdown or two where he gets like 4 catches for 35, 40 yards and a touchdown, and he's a great week to have him in your lineup. And other weeks he gets 2 catches for 8 yards and 2 carries for 11 yards, and that's all you get out of him. That's going to be the Woody Marks as we move forward. My last one in tier 12 here, Dylan Sampson with the Cleveland Browns. Um, as I mentioned earlier, I see him starting this year as the number 3 behind Judkins and Ford. I see him eventually taking over ahead of Ford, but because I see Judkins as a bell cow, because I think the Tennessee offense really helped inflate Sampson's stats in college. Yes, he has good speed. Yes, sees the hole and goes, but he had some big holes because of that Tennessee offense and the way they spread out defenses, and it was in college and so forth. I have some concerns about his ability to run up the middle. Yes, I know he had a lot of touchdowns, but in terms of really having a ton of, being a 15 to 20 carry person, 15 to 20 carry person per game, I just don't see it. And I see, once again, Judkins playing that role. So 25, 30% of the snaps, Sampson over time. Judkins has it. Sampson is just a backup. That's why he's way down on my list. If you're not a fan of Judkins, if you don't have the faith in him, have some of the concerns like I do, like sometimes his vision and so forth, Sampson might go higher up the list. But if you're comfortable with Judkins, to me, this is where we have Sampson sitting from a tier perspective. Okay, let us move to tier 13. And I call this the next tier of pass catchers that expect to max out as a number 3 target on their teams. So, and that's why we start with Jalen Noel in this tier. I love Jalen Noel, the player, but there's now Nico Collins. There is now his teammate from Iowa State, Jaden Higgins. There is now Christian Kirk, who, if he does well, could be re-signed next year as a side note. Granted, it's only a 1-year deal right now. They will have Tank Dell coming back. Now, granted, Tank Dell had a gruesome injury, and maybe he doesn't come back, and maybe the Texans do that. Maybe the Texans know that, excuse me, and thus that's part of the reason they picked Noel. But even with that, and then with the tight ends and the way they've demonstrated in the past, they like to use the tight ends, whether it be Dalton Schultz, and then as he moves on, you'll have Cade Stover move into that role. Plus the way they drafted Woody Marks for dump offs and so forth. I just don't see Noel getting enough targets and share to be anything more than a number 3 target share person on the Texans. Okay, so that's why I have Noel much lower. Now, can injuries happen? Yes. Can those injuries create opportunities? Yes, they can. But as of now, that's where I have Noel. Isaac Tesla, or Tesla, or however you pronounce his name, out of Arkansas, is next from the in this tier, and of course he was drafted with the Detroit Lions. The Lions absolutely loved him. They loved him because they saw the way he got after it when they were down in the Senior Bowl, particularly on the blocking and how he's frustrating the heck out of defensive backs. They loved the speed and the athleticism they saw. And they also saw that the quarterback at Arkansas wasn't exactly a strong throw of the ball. I can't remember the youngster they had this year and last year, KJ Jefferson. So not a whole lot to talk about at the quarterback position in Arkansas this year, these past couple of years. So his first 3 years, he played at Hillsdale College, did really well, and then he transferred to Arkansas for his last 2 years. He only had 34 catches and 28 catches the last couple of years. He did average 19.5 yards per catch. He did run that 4.43 40 and was very athletic and is very athletic, as I talked about earlier. He is very physical in the blocking and so forth. But what is he? He is a number 3 from a target perspective and possibly even number 4. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, Jamison Williams. Tim Patrick will probably start this year as Tesla comes up to speed, and then Tesla takes over that Tim Patrick role. That Tim Patrick role wasn't exactly a major viable role from a fantasy perspective, to say the least. So once again, that's where I see Tesla saying. I know there's rumors out there that Jamison Williams, they may not give an extension and blah, blah, blah. I'm not buying that, particularly the way he finished the year last year. So my assumption here is Jamison Williams is staying, and that's where and Tesla sits in. Next, Jalen Royals. You could argue for putting Jalen Royals higher on the list. 4.4 240 going to Kansas City at 205 pounds. I am a big fan of him. The problem with is his best role is that Rashee Rice role. What does the Kansas City depth chart look like right now? Xavier Worthy, Rashee Rice, Marquise Hollywood Brown, Juju Smith-Schuster, and now Royals is probably the number 5 wide receiver. But you may have heard that Worthy had some legal risk this offseason. Rashee Rice is coming off a knee injury. And on top of that, he had this driving episode in Dallas that still hasn't been adjudicated yet. Marquise Hollywood Brown is on a 1-year contract. And Juju Smith-Schuster is not the Juju Smith of a few years ago, back in his Pittsburgh days, or many years ago, I should say. Check out Juju Smith's age if you haven't done that lately. You'd be quite surprised to find how old Juju Smith is now. Juju Smith-Schuster is. So there is potential opportunity to Jalen Royals to leapfrog up this chart with the Kansas City offense, with Andy Reid, with a Patrick Mahomes. So I think I've just talked myself that he should be in a much higher tier. Shame on me for not thinking that all the way through as I am right now. But Royals, I think, has an opportunity to move up, because I do think that with all that's ahead of him, yes, right now he could maybe be only as high as a number 3, but with some of these other challenges with Worthy and Rice potentially, yeah, he can get in that number 1 and 2 range for Kansas City. So let's move him up the list. Okay. And not to mention Kelsey will retire here after the next year. Next, Kyle Williams. I know other people have Kyle Williams also much higher as well. They're like, who else do they have? Okay, yes, they have Stephon Diggs, and he might even be there week 1. Yes, Kyle Williams is explosive. Yes, he's elusive. But I am just not a fan, and I should have talked about this a little bit earlier, of some of these smaller wide receivers in terms of them truly becoming number 1. So he's 5'10" and a soaking wet 190 pounds. So that's why I have him this low. I just don't see someone like that being a player who's going to be your 90 catch, 1,100 yards, 10 touchdown player. I just don't see that. The Patriots depth chart. Yes, it's a jumble. There's Mac Hollins that they signed, they signed him for culture, they signed him for special teams, and they signed him because he's one heck of a blocker. And they are going to want to run the ball a heck of a lot more, i.e. the Travian Henderson, why we have him so high. They do have Kayshon Boutte, who, look, he had 45 catches last year and had a couple of nice deep balls and demonstrated good chemistry with Drake May. They have Demario Douglas, who I think Diggs actually supplants Douglas in the slot as opposed on the outside. They have Kendrick Bourne. Now, Vrabel is new, but the GM is not, and they drafted Jalen Polk and Javon Baker last year. I think those two, because of the draft capital, both are going to hang around, and both of them they're going to still try and develop. I don't think they're going to let Vrabel let those guys go that easily. So I think there's just this hodgepodge of stuff, and I just don't know if Kyle Williams is going to get the playing time, and I just don't like that size factor of him. So that's why I have him lower. You can argue with me, um, or disagree with me, I should say. I really don't like getting into arguments on these things because everybody has an opinion. That's fine. But anyway, that's why I have Williams down in tier 13. Terrence Ferguson, Los Angeles Rams. Let's talk about their tight end depth chart. Tyler Higbee, age 32, came back very nicely off of that knee injury last year. I actually dumped him in a dynasty league before that, also because they had given Kobe Parkinson a very nice 3-year contract as a free agent from Seattle last offseason. So Higbee will be back this year. Parkinson is a great blocker. Ferguson is not. Now, do they think they can develop Ferguson? Yes, the Rams do think they can develop him from a blocking perspective. Sean McVay came on and said the reason they target him and they target him so early with probably was pick 63 in round 2 was that they see lots of possibilities how they can use him. They like his speed. They like his hands. He did have 13.7 yards per catch on 43 catches. He's had 16 TDs over his 4 years in college, so he is a red zone target. Um, but they also have Devontae Adams. They also have Puka Nacua. So Terrence Ferguson, as much as they used Higbee when he came back in the playoffs and so forth, that was an outlier, folks. That wasn't how they typically use Higbee. Are they going to try and use Ferguson like that? Yes, but I think there are some developmental needs, and I do have him, and once again, plus Puka and Devontae Adams. So I do have him much further down the list as my next tight end after the Taylor, after the Arroyo, okay, which we talked about much earlier. All right, the last two in this tier, let's talk about the Tennessee Titans. Jameer DK out of Florida. Malik, and I had practiced this one and I forgot. Ian Manor from Stanford, both going to Tennessee. Now, when I talked about Cam Ward earlier, we talked about the fact we had Calvin Ridley and Tyler Lockett probably as the 2 starting wide receivers, but both of them over 30. Of course, Ridley sat out a year, but Tyler Lockett going on 33. So what will happen this year? And not to mention they signed Van Jefferson to free agency. I know he's not much, but he probably is the number 3. That gives DK and Alik an opportunity to become pros, to learn systems, to become acclimated, and potentially positioned to replace all those guys that I talked about in year 2. Maybe not really, but certainly Lockett, certainly Van Jefferson. So this is a pick for the future. But remember, these guys weren't exactly picked in the first or second round or the third round. So let's be clear on that, or early third round. So as a result, that makes them risky. That's why they're further down the draft board as well. Remember, a lot of people like to say, oh, I found this hit gem. Oh, yes, this is my guy, blah, blah, blah. And I have a my guy later. I will admit that. We'll talk about him later. But most of the time, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th rounders, from a fantasy football perspective, don't really pan out as even top 36 players, folks. They might get 1 year in there. Usually it's 25 to 36. It's rare that you have a Puka Nacua that jumps in the top 12 that come out of rounds 4 through 7. Yes, they make rosters. Yes, they're viable. Yes, they get snaps. But in terms of fantasy football relevant, not a lot. That is the risk with these guys here with 4th round draft picks. Not to mention, I do like some of the things Tennessee's doing, but they have a lot to prove from a passing game perspective. So they are down in tier 13. Next, we are going to move to tier 14, and we're in tier 15, and we're going to get into some more IDPs in these 2 rounds, folks. And I've been talking for an hour and 18 minutes, so Ricky's going to grab me some Diet Coke here for a second. All righty, tier 14. I'll call this my potential stud IDP DTs, although a little bit of patience may be required, with a couple of strong safeties that you need to keep an eye out for. Walter Nolan and Derek Harmon are the 2 that I have here. Now, I love Walter Nolan's ability to penetrate. Same with Derek Harmon, but Nolan is even a notch better than Derek Harmon on that in terms of penetration, getting tackles for loss and sacks, and once again, your IDP scoring system, that could be huge. The problem right now that I'm worried about for Nolan, at least for this year, unless changes happen, is the depth chart with the Arizona Cardinals. They really loaded up on defense in free agency in the draft. So in that interior defensive line kind of mode, they have Justin Jones coming back from injury, who was the big free agent signing they had from Chicago the year before. They signed Dalvin Tomlinson from the Bears, excuse me, from the Browns, wrong B, when Tomlinson was released for salary cap reasons. Darius Robinson was their number one pick last year out of Missouri. They love him, even though he had a lot of injuries last year and didn't play much. They signed Calais Campbell at age 38, but they didn't sign him to sit on the bench. They signed him to play. Plus Walter Nolan, plus Dante Stills, plus LJ Collier. So there's a lot of bodies there, and that just tells me Arizona's going to do a lot of rotation. Maybe not only this year, but potentially into the future as well. That's why I'm a little bit more nervous on Nolan. That's why I don't have him quite as high. But he is my number one defensive tackle because from an IDP fantasy football scoring perspective. Derek Harmon, as I mentioned earlier, love his penetration capability. Really demonstrated really well in Oregon after being so-so at Michigan State. Light came on, etc. when he went to Oregon. But he's going to be in that 3-4 instead of a 4-3. So that has me worried. The only reason I have him here, though, is because of Cam Hayward. And look what Cam Hayward is doing that same system in Pittsburgh as a 3-4 defensive ends slash interior defensive lineman for 3-4s. Can Harmon learn from Hayward, harness that learning, and become a mini Hayward? I think the possibility is pretty high, and that's why I'm willing to take that risk for him and put him here at this point. Risk with him and put him at this spot here in Tier 14. Now, two safeties, Xavier Watts for Atlanta, Kevin Winston, who got drafted by Tennessee. Let's start with Xavier Watts. I expect him to be starting next to Jesse Bates this year. And a year from now, I expect him to be starting next to the other draft pick, Billy Bowman Jr., who was also drafted. He was out of Oklahoma, but Bowman did not make my top 100. Watts is not a blazer at a 4.58 40, but he is a physical tackler, and we love these safeties that tackle. Had 134 tackles over the last 2 years. Also had good coverage instincts, makes plays, 27 pass defenses, and 13 interceptions over the last 2 years. He is a big play waiting to happen, and he's a tackler waiting to happen. You could argue I should have him much higher up the list when you hear those stats. I do worry about the 4.58. I do worry about the fact that maybe Bowman sneaks in there and earns a starting spot this year, and Watts doesn't get it until next year. But I do think Watts will get it. Watts, like I said, could be potentially higher on this list, but he's got a bright future. The second safety that I've mentioned so far with Emmanuel, with Seattle being the first one at a much higher tier. Kevin Winston Jr. from Penn State with Tennessee is the other one in this tier. He had a knee injury and only played 2 games in 24. But look, he is a very healthy 213 pounds. He's also a physical tackler. He had 61 tackles in 2023. Feel comfortable they can cover the tight end, the big slots. Can he play that box safety role? Will Tennessee use him that way? That is my concern right now. Tennessee has Amani Hooker coming back this year. They signed Xavier Woods in free agency out of Carolina. Do I think Winston Jr. can leapfrog Woods in particular? Yes, I do. But and if that does, I do think they end up maybe having Winston a little bit more of a box role and Hooker a little bit more deeper. So that's how I see it. Tennessee doesn't have a ton of depth at cornerback, and maybe they use 3 safeties as well that could potentially get him on the field in a 3 safety alignment with 3 cornerbacks, as opposed to more of a 4 cornerback, 2 safety situation. So there is some upside to Winston here. I like him here. Here's my number 3 safety. Y'all are wondering where's Malachi Starks. We'll get to him a little bit later, but he's not we haven't gotten to him through tier 14 yet. Let's move to tier 15, folks. And I know we're at an hour and 24 minutes from a broadcast perspective. I'm going to keep going. If you need to go do something, you need to go do laundry, get back to work, whatever it might be, pause, come back to this mark here at tier 15 and pick it up from there because we've got 10 more tiers to go. All right. Tier 15. This is the linebacker tier. And I'm calling this a tier of questionable but potential linebacker 2s and 3s. And that's this year, by the way, potential twos and threes, but you have to kind of pick your poison and hope you get lucky to a certain degree. I've also renamed this tier the Tyrell Dodson and Nicholas Morrow tier, which is they're guys who get playing time and can put up IDP counting stats if they end up playing. This was not a great group of linebackers. And I think a lot of teams got spooked, and then there started being this run on linebackers much higher than a lot of these guys should have gone in the draft, quite frankly. And so, do they have opportunities to play? Yes. Are some of these guys nothing more than potentially two down linebackers, or maybe third down pass coverage type of linebackers? Yeah. Are there a bunch of three down stud linebackers in this list? I don't think so, folks. So that's why all these linebackers outside of the Campbell and Walker, and I told you about my concerns earlier on those guys as examples. That's why these folks are all the way down at tier 15. And we're going to spend time as we talk through it talking about depth charts in particular. So I've got Nick Martin on the list here. First, as you can see, Nick Martin signed with the 49ers. Was drafted by the 49ers. What do we know about the 49ers and their linebackers? Got Fred Warner, number one. D. Winters was the person who played in the spot where Dre Greenlaw would have been when Greenlaw was injured. Of course, Greenlaw has gone on to Denver. I love Greenlaw in Denver if he can stay healthy. By the way, the rumor that he might miss the whole year because this quadricep injury is apparently not true if you hadn't heard that. So he should be fine. It's just a tendon strain. Back to the 49ers and Nick Martin. Martin will be competing against D. Winters. Martin was injured this past year. Let me double check my notes here. Yes, he was. He missed a good chunk of 2023. He now in 2024. In 2023, he led the Big 12 in tackles with 140 freaking tackles, 16 tackles for loss, 6 sacks. He did run a 4.53 40, so he's got great speed, but he's only 5'11", 221. So he's truly a will linebacker, number 2 linebacker. Don't see him ever moving into that Mike linebacker, that Fred Warner type of role. Can he beat out D. Winters for the role? He certainly has higher draft capital than what D. Winters had, but D. Winters has the experience edge on him. I see Winters starting the year, particularly with Martin having missed so much time last year and Martin being on the smaller side. So that's my spiel on Nick Martin. Let's move into Chris Paul next. Okay. Signed with LA Rams. What do we know about the Rams? They don't put a whole lot of stock in linebackers. They don't make a lot of investment in these off-ball linebackers. Their current linebacker group, Troy Reeder, who they re-signed, who was the starting number 1 Mike linebacker last year before he got hurt. Omar Spates, who was an undrafted free agent out of LSU, who played more than number 2 linebacker. He couldn't outplay Christian Roseboom for the number 1 linebacker position. They signed Nate Landman. I had someone put in the notes on YouTube underneath that Nate Landman's going to start for the Rams. And that basically saying he disagreed with what I had said about Nate Landman. Nate Landman was a restricted free agent that the Falcons were more than happy to let go. Didn't try and re-sign him at a restricted free agent amount. So I disagree with the person that commented about Nate Landman that, yeah, he's going to start with the Rams. And now we throw Chris Paul Jr., who I believe his nickname is Pooh. He played at Ole Miss, was a green dot type of player for Ole Miss, was all over the field, made a lot of tackles. He doesn't have a ton of competition, but can he come in and leapfrog Reeder and Spates? I think I said Spites, but I believe it's actually pronounced Spates. Can he leapfrog them? And Landman, who's not that great, but at least has some experience. And given Paul having some size issues as well, 6'1", 225-ish, whatever, not exactly the biggest linebacker, also struggled some in pass coverage as well. Can he get playing time? Yeah. But as you can see, not an overwhelming ringing endorsement from Ricky Rod on Chris Paul. Let's go to Danny Stutzman. Okay. One of the things I like about Stutzman is that he could tackle. One of the biggest problems with the Saints last year was tackling, a lot of missed tackles. Now, Last offseason, for some strange, ridiculous reason, Mickey Loomis, the GM, signed Pete Werner to a 3-year extension. Otherwise, he would have been a free agent this year. And then on top of that, Kellen Moore goes and hires a 3-4 linebacker, a 3-4 defensive coordinator. So from a linebacker perspective, it changes things a lot. And on the edge, they have folks like Carl Granderson. They have folks like Chase Young, who they re-signed. That's who I see more on the edge for the Saints. That moves Pete Werner to the inside. Pete Werner was having trouble tackling. Could Stutzman move in and be the tackler in place of Pete Werner? Yes, he could, but boy, that once again that extension then looks really bad. Could Stutzman replace Demario Davis a year from now when Demario Davis probably finally retires? Yes, he could. Stutzman is a downhill thumper tackler who has struggled at Oklahoma in pass coverage as well. So another 2-down type of running back. Excuse me, not running back, linebacker. Sorry, folks. His competition beyond Davis and Werner. Nefi Sewell, undrafted free agent. Jalen Ford, a late round linebacker draft pick last year. DeMarco Jackson, late round draft pick from a couple of years ago at linebacker. So there's not a whole lot of competition here, just a lot of late round or undrafted free agent linebackers. Stutzman can get playing time, but I envision him being a 2-down thumper at this point in time. Either that or he'll get abused in coverage just like Pete Werner has the past couple of years. Okay, that is Stutzman. Demetrius Knight Jr. in Cincinnati. Good news. I do think he will start in Cincinnati. Why do I think that will happen? Because Jermaine Pratt has asked to be traded, will probably be released here, and that will create an opening for Knight to move right into that starting lineup. Okay. Over the last 2 years, 178 tackles, 13 and a half tackles for loss. Ran a 4.58 40, but he only had a 1.63 10-yard split. And one of the concerns that was also brought up about him by other people that analyzed him was he was slow to react. So what do we have here? Another potential run thumper. He also struggled in pass coverage as well. There was concerns about his lateral agility. He was hustle sideline to sideline, as you can tell by those tackle numbers, but not great agility. So Demetrius Knight should get a starting role, but down the list. Jack Kaiser with the Jacksonville Jaguars. This was a surprising pick. Now, Jacksonville's going to have a new defensive scheme. Thank goodness. Maybe Foye Oluokun will actually play 100% of the snaps again. But drafting Kaiser as early as they did, does that signal that they're not going to re-sign Devin Lloyd? Does Jack Kaiser start off as a Sam linebacker this year, and with Oluokun and Devin Lloyd being the number 1 and number 2, and the next year maybe not only does Lloyd go, but does Oluokun potentially go as well, and Kaiser moves into that role as Oluokun is now into his 30s. That could potentially happen, but once again, while Kaiser is a football player, at the Senior Bowl when a bunch of safeties dropped out, he even went played safety at the Senior Bowl. Jacksonville loved that about him. He is a football player. The fact that Notre Dame, the Jacksonville GM even talked about the fact that Notre Dame went far into the playoffs, and then he went and not only showed up at the the Senior Bowl, but practiced and played in the Senior Bowl. They loved all that about him. So does Kaiser have potential? Yes, but right now he's a 2-down guy as he's struggled in coverage as well. Next on the list, Cody Simon from Ohio State, from the national champion Ohio State Buckeyes. He goes to Arizona. I told you I would talk about the depth chart. There, Kaiser White is a free agent who he didn't re-sign. Kaiser White isn't exactly a stud. He was just a solid player. Cody Simon could be Kaiser White. Right now, his competition is Mack Wilson. Akeem Davis-Gaither, who could never break the top 2 in Cincinnati, was the number 3 linebacker in Cincinnati, who Arizona signed as a free agent. Mykal Walker, who was released by the Falcons and then went to the Commanders, and they didn't try and re-sign him. And Owen Pappoe, a late-round draft pick out of Auburn from a couple of years ago. That's his competition at linebacker. Cody Simon has the opportunity to get playing time and maybe even become that 3-down linebacker. However, this year, I do see Mack Wilson starting, and in that Mike position that Kaiser White used to play. I see Akeem Davis-Gaylor playing that role that Mack Wilson played last year, which is usually about a 65 to 70% snap count role, which wasn't very productive. Over time, can Simon move into that starting role that Kaiser White had? Yes, but probably not this year. And he too will have to work in his pass coverage. The good news for him is he is a little bit more athletic and did play some safety in his career. But that once again, there was a reason they moved him from safety down to linebacker. So coverage could be an issue. Last in this tier, Teddy Buchanan with the Baltimore Ravens. Now, Harbaugh said, their head coach, that during the offseason before the draft, that he expected Trent Simpson to regain that starting weak side linebacker role, particularly with Malik Harrison having moved on to the Steelers. But now then they go ahead and draft Teddy Buchanan, who is once again a pretty good athlete who is actually better in coverage than as a run stopper per se, and is probably better as a weak side linebacker from that regard than more of the thumpers that these other guys are. So Trent Simpson will have some competition. So once again, a potential IDP loser there. But Buchanan is not going to, step into that Roquan Smith #1 linebacker, Mike linebacker role with Baltimore anytime soon. We've seen that #2 linebacker role with Patrick Queen be productive, and you can see it helps productivity if you have someone pretty decent in there because Patrick Queen got a great payday out of it and went on to Pittsburgh to cash in on that. But he struggled some in Pittsburgh's defense versus what he did in this role with Baltimore, where Buchanan and our Simpson will be playing. So there is upside for Buchanan in this role if he can become a better tackler, and that'll be the challenge for him. So lots of warts in this tier 15, lots of opportunities for playing time, but that's why when I label this tier, the Tyrell Dodson, Nicholas Morrow tier, are the #2, #3 linebackers. They could get you some IDP counting stats, and they may play a lot this year, but they could be easily replaced a year from now. That is tier 15. Let us move on to tier 16. And in tier 16, we are going to talk about a few more running backs. And sorry, I was having trouble getting to scroll for those that are watching on the screen. So for tier 16, right now, these are most likely #3 running backs with occasional #2 glimpses, but still shots in the dark and could have opportunity for longer term #2 opportunities, at least a couple of these folks do. First one is Devin Neal. Obviously, Kamara's the #1 in New Orleans. Behind him, you have Kendre Miller, who hasn't exactly lit the world on fire because of injuries and more injuries, and he got into Dennis Allen's doghouse. Although they did still start playing him more late in the year last year ahead of Jamal Williams, and he did flash, which was great. But there's Miller, there's Clyde Edwards-Helaire, there's Jordan Mims. So there is opportunity for Devin Neal, who I did like quite a bit. But once again, he was a 6th-round draft pick. Yes, the running back class was deep. Maybe they waited purposely later and he would have gone earlier in other draft classes. But he was a round 6 pick. So that's part of the reason I'm having him down here in tier 16. And yes, Alvin Kamara is 30 years old. And yes, there's risk with Kendre Miller. So I do like Devin Neal. Some people will push him higher up. I do think Miller, with the doghouse thing behind him, with Kellen Moore, I do see Miller being the #2 and Neal the #3 this year. A year from now, it might look a little bit different. Kamara could move on. It could be Miller and Neal, maybe somebody else as well. That's always the risk. It's like, well, if Kamara leaves his free agency, then it'll be Miller and Neal. Yeah, but then there'll be a whole free agency period and another draft that happens as well. So that's why I have him down here at tier 16 because he's a #3 right now. Taj Brooks with Cincinnati, same type of situation. Ahead of him, Chase Brown, 30-year-old Samaje Perine. Perine to protect Burrow on obvious passing situations. Think we can see him out there from a blocking perspective and also catching more balls. And I think Chase Brown won't get as many snaps. Do I think Taj Brooks could get a few snaps? Maybe. Do I see it more like a Travion Williams kind of situation where he plays a lot of special teams and very little on offense? Yeah, that could happen as well. Can Taj Brooks replace Perine next year as the #2 back? Potentially he could, yes. But there's a lot of ifs in all of this, so that's why I have Brooks all the way down here at tier 16. Trevor Etienne, Carolina Panthers. What do we know about the Carolina Panthers depth chart? Well, they have Chuba Hubbard, who they just signed to an extension. They just signed Rico Dowdle to, I believe it was a 2-year deal. They drafted Jonathan Brooks in round 2 last year. Now, granted, 2 ACL injuries may be too hard for him to overcome. We've seen with Javonte Williams, one can be hard to overcome. So maybe that puts Etienne in the third slot. He's definitely ahead of Raheem Blackshear, particularly since he was drafted, and he has special teams capabilities like returning kicks, does Etienne. So that's where I see Etienne right now, a number 3 back without line of sight really to passing up Hubbard or Dowdle, and maybe a few pass catches here and there, maybe a few carries late in games of blowouts, etc. But that's about it for Etienne. Lastly, Jordan James with the 49ers. Everybody gets excited. Jordan James, 49ers running back. Death taxes in the 49ers drafting a running back in the fourth, fifth type of round. That's your Jordan James this year. Dane Brugler was high on him, who does the beast for the Athletic. Others were not nearly as high on him as Dane was. I do think Dane is fantastic, by the way, as a side note, but there's definitely a difference in opinions on James. Right now, Christian McCaffrey sits ahead of him. Isaac Guerrero sits ahead of him. And if this were game day, Patrick Taylor, because of his special teams work, would probably be the number 3 ahead of Jordan James. If there was a McCaffrey injury, which is probable, if there was a Guerrero injury, could James leapfrog Taylor and move into that number 2 running back with Guerrero or McCaffrey, depending on which other one was injured? That one being in that number 1 slot. Yes, that could absolutely happen as well. But James is also not on the bigger side as well, and I think some people are hoping for him to be the next Bucky Irving. Unfortunately, I don't see that. Others do. I don't see opportunity for playing time in the next couple of years for him. That's why I have him all the way down in tier 16. You do hear me talking a lot about, and a quick tangent, and I should have mentioned this at the very beginning of this podcast, but from a dynasty perspective, it's so hard to look out 3, 4, 5 years what's going to happen. So I just try and look out what could potentially happen in the next 2 years or so for a lot of these players, particularly when you get past the stud levels in those first few tiers. And right now, there's just not line of sight to that happening on a lot of these folks. So there you have it. Okay, now we're going to move to tier 17 and tier 18 and tier 19, and we're going to get to some more IDPs in these tiers, folks. I told you we're going to come back to Malachi Starks. And I purposely put him here, but I actually view him lower than this from an IDP tiers perspective. And you can say, Ricky, he was the first safety drafted. He's going to the Baltimore Ravens. Yes, that is correct. And the word on the street is they're going to use him in that Marcus Williams role, who they signed from the Saints in free agency a couple years ago, who did really well when he first went to the Ravens and then just absolutely fell apart and then got released this past offseason, did Marcus Williams. Malachi Starks is expected to play that role that Marcus Williams played, which is fantastic news for Kyle Hamilton, so that he can start playing more closer to the box and in the slot and so forth as he has in the past and playing that third linebacker role as well. Awesome news for Hamilton if that's the way it plays out. A butter, however, and the reason why I should have moved him lower, I did keep him here. There is a chance that because the way Hamilton did handle the communications on the back end of the defense and how much better the defense played, that they do keep Hamilton deep. And Starks is the one that starts playing in the slot. And Starks gets a little bit more of that box stuff. But I do think even if that happens, Hamilton and Starks get used more interchangeably than what happened late in the year when Hamilton played a lot more deep snaps. Darius Washington was the one that got a little bit closer to the line. So that's the Starks and Hamilton speech. We're going to have to pay attention as the offseason progresses and even in the preseason. So if you do play Starks, what's the potential usage for him on the field, and thus what's his IDP upside and or downside? That's why I'm not willing to pick him any higher than this. The other one in this tier, Lathan Ransom, who got drafted by the Carolina Panthers. So let's talk about the Panthers draft depth chart at safety. They let Jordan Fuller go in free agency. They let Nick Scott go in free agency. So that they signed Trevin Moehrig to come in and start as one safety, and the other safety spot is open. That means Lathan Ransom right now, as a fourth round pick, has the opportunity to move into that second starting role next to Moehrig. Moehrig has a history of playing deep in other defenses. Ransom's strength is not in coverage. Ransom's strength is as a hard hitting box safety. He is not great in coverage. And so that's where I see Ransom playing, and that could be very good IDP defensive stats opportunities for Ransom. Why do I have him this low? My gut just tells me that they're going to sign a free agent safety, maybe someone like a Julian Blackman, maybe someone like a Justin Simmons, as an example, who's out on the street currently, and Ransom will be a third safety this year and move into a safety role, a starting safety role next year. So that's how I see the Carolina Panthers safety room shaking out. Let's move to tier 18. Landon Jackson, JT Tuimoloau from Ohio State, Jordan Birch from Arizona, Ashton Gillette from Kansas City. And I know I butchered a couple of those names. Apologies once again. On the Landon Jackson side of things, the real issue is playing time. The real issue is great athletic measurables, but unfortunately, um, not as productive as you would hope that athletic profile would have been at Arkansas. Um, he had 6.5 sacks each of the last 2 years. You would have hoped a little bit more for someone with at 6'6" and 250 and a lot of the speed and athleticism that he showed. On top of that, in front of him, he has folks like Greg Russo, for example. He has Joey Bosa sitting in front of him as a couple of examples. And there's some other depth pieces as well. They signed Michael Hoyt from the Rams, who unfortunately is suspended to start the year. So you have all of that in front of him as well. On top of that, Jackson might be moved inside for pass rushing opportunities, which actually might be better for him. But still, I think there's going to be some playing time risk in particular for Jackson. I think he's going to have to learn to bend more, learn more arsenal with in terms of his moves on the outside. Good coaching can do that for him. So he's got some potential, but just not in the short term. Tori Maolo from Ohio State, who's going to the Colts. The depth chart in front of him: Kwity Paye, Taekwon Lewis, Latu from last year, the number one pick from last year. Samson Ebicon coming back from a preseason knee injury. 4 defensive ends already. Of course, Deo Odeyingbo went to the Bears in free agency. But there's 4 others ahead of him, which gives him a good learning opportunity. The other interesting news, though, is that Paye, Lewis, and Ebicon all in last year of their contracts. So only Latu would be under contract going into 2026. That's where the potential upside comes into play. Now, the college playoffs in particular, not that he was bad during the regular season, but he really took off in the college playoffs. In the 4 games, 23 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks. Huge in those 4 college playoff games, and a big contributor to Ohio State winning things. So he has the potential. Now, he's not as athletic as a number of the edges that we talked about earlier, your Shamar Stewarts, as examples, okay? So he's not in that kind of range, but he could be a solid player. He could be like another Deo Odeyingbo if you're looking for a comparison. Jordan Birch with Arizona, former 5-star high school recruit. Believe that he'll be playing more on the edge as a bigger edge as opposed to the inside in general. And we talked earlier when I talked about Walter Nolan about Arizona and all those inside defensive linemen, interior defensive linemen. So you can go back and listen to that if you're joining the podcast later, jumped around in it. But on the outside, they have Josh Sweat. They re-signed Baron Browning, who they had traded for the Broncos, and they really were happy with his progress that he made. They have Zaven Collins, who is probably in his last year with the Cardinals. So, by the way, try and trade him if you have him in Dynasty. And B.J. Ojulari, who unfortunately hurt his knee last year and will come back. and then you have Jordan Birch in that mix as well, and you have a Xavier Thomas, late round draft pick from last year out of Clemson. So once again, Arizona really invested in the the defense, and on top of that, in particular, in that front line, the interior defensive lineman, and on the edges. So what that means for Birch, a risk of a lot of playing time, even if in a lot of snaps, which makes it hard to get defensive counting stats for IDP. Even if they say, oh, they're going to move Birch to the inside for pass rushing capability, there's still a lot of people in there that we talked about earlier. You Walter Nolans, for example, that are going to be in there competing for playing time snaps on those rushing downs. So see lots of platooning there. One of the reasons I have Birch down here. But as you go into year two, and a lot of those guys fall out of the mix, Calais Campbell retires, Justin Jones' contract expires and they don't resign him, etc. That creates a lot more opportunity for Birch in year two. Ashton Gillott in Kansas City, boy, this guy, he's a little bit on the smaller side, but runs a decent 4.65 40 for edge, which is very nice. But he does also have shorter arms and a shorter wingspan, in addition to being a little bit on the shorter height challenge side for an edge player. Major hustler, plays very physical and all, does play very hard. In the last 2 years, though, listen to the pretty decent stats, 88 tackles. Now, that's over 2 years, so that's 44, if you average it. 24 and a half tackles for loss, 15 and a half sacks, though only 4.5 this past year. He had much more of that in 2023. But you look at the Kansas City Chiefs depth chart, they have Felix hyphenated last name that I'm not even going to try to pronounce right now, who really hasn't done anything over the past couple of years. They have Michael Dana, who's been starting. So they have George Karlaftis on one side. They probably have Charles Omenihu, who came back late in the year from a knee injury from the previous year, probably starting on the other side. But you could see Gillette moving into that type of Michael Dana type of role and leapfrogging him, and maybe even getting a little bit more pass rush opportunity and juice as time goes on. Maybe from a blitzing perspective, maybe they use him in that Sam role where Leo Chenal sometimes plays and have him blitz from there as well. So creating some tackle for loss opportunities. So there is some opportunity, but some other things need to happen in front of the former Louisville star to get more playing time. That is your tier 18. Let's go to tier 19, folks. And we are cruising along here at an hour and 50 minutes. I will pick up the pace for you to wrap it up. In tier 19, we have what I'm calling the shots in the dark defensive tackle where patience is required. And you'll be surprised to see, just like Malachi Starks way down the list, I have Mason Graham way down here. Yes, I know he was the overall number 5 pick for Cleveland Browns. Yes, everybody has him as one of the few graded first round picks. I just don't think he will be a top IDP scorer over time. In the last 3 years, yes, he had 107 tackles over 3 years. So what is that, about 35 a year, give or take? He had 17 tackles for loss, which is only 5 a year. He only had 9 sacks, all that being over the last 3 years, so only 3 sacks a year. I talked about it on my last podcast, the pre-draft podcast, that he has short arms and a short wingspan. Do I think he will create havoc? Yes. Do I think he will get some tackles? Yes. Do I think he will create the type of big plays, sacks, tackles for loss, passes, defense that create bigger scoring in IDP? No, I do not. So that's why I have him down here with some of these other flyers of defensive tackle. Omar Norman Lott, love his potential next to Chris Jones on the inside in Kansas City at defensive tackle. He is a penetrator and he can create sacks. He had 9.5 sacks in the last 2 years. That doesn't sound a lot, but he only averaged 17 snaps per game, the way the Tennessee Volunteers used him. So that creates upside. He is very athletic, but there is high risk with this. Kansas City has lost over the past couple of years several defensive tackles. They lost Wharton. They lost one to I believe it was Buffalo, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry, I can't remember. Oh, Derek Nottie, they lost. So there is opportunity for him as well. So Omar Norman Lott is quite the defensive tackle flyer, particularly when you get big points for sacks. TJ Sanders in Buffalo, he would back up Ed Oliver and eventually replace Ed Oliver over time is my thought process here. In the last 2 years, 8.5 sacks, 16.5 tackles for loss. He's once again more of a penetrator type. He's not one of these nose tackle types that's gonna, trying to occupy two blockers. Same thing for CJ West, the next person on the list here, who got drafted by San Francisco. This year, I see the 49ers starting Jordan Elliott and Kevin Gibbons most of the year unless they get hurt. Next year, the two draft picks, Alfred Collins and CJ West, will be the starters. Alfred Collins being a little bit more of a run stuffer with some pocket presence, but he's not in the top 100. CJ West, or 101, I should say. CJ West, I do see that penetrating capability at Indiana. And so he's once again a potential flyer for these sack heavy leagues from a scoring perspective, tackle for loss, heavy scoring, etc. That's tier 19. Tier 20, I have two quarterbacks. Calling my shot in the dark quarterbacks where patience may be required. And even with that, they probably top out as a top 14 type, top 18 type of quarterback in terms of fantasy football scoring. Tyler Shuck, ironically, one of the comparisons of him was one of the comps was Derek Carr. Very ironic that he ended up with the Saints, and that he's got a good arm. He does well in clean pockets, but he's going to struggle under pressure. He does have a lot of injuries, but a lot of those are not like an ACL tear, for example. It's not like it was anything along those lines, which at least bodes better for him from a recovery perspective. He did start a lot of games in college, but not like Bo Nix that he started a ton of games in college, even though he's played to age 26. He does have some mobility to him, so that's what gets him in that 14 to 18 range potentially, but you can see I have it way down here. Of course, the other one is Shadir Sanders. What I said on the previous podcast, go back and listen to it, is he's good at a lot of things, but he's not great or special at any one thing. Can he run an offense? Yes. Can he be a starter? I think he can. But once again, he tops out of the top 14 to 18 range. I just don't see the athletic ability. I don't see the rushing yards that would propel him like we talked about with Cam Ward earlier. All right, we're going to move to tier 21 here real quick. And I keep on saying real quick, but I love talking to y'all and filling y'all in. So hopefully you're digesting this over time. But if you've been loyal and sticking through it without taking a break, thank you for doing so. Okay, my tier 21, I'm calling it the shot in the dark pass catchers where a lot of patience is required. Some people have Harold Fannin much higher. Look, he had fantastic stats, but he did this at Bowling Green. Yeah, so granted, he did have a couple of Power 4 games, and I think one of those he did very well against Penn State and all. 117 catches, 1,500 plus yards, 10 TDs. Fantastic. Thing that I hate is his athleticism didn't wow. Now, people are trying to say, yeah, but they said the same thing about Isaiah Likely. Look how well he's done, so forth. Yeah, Likely is still a number 2 tight end in Baltimore. They're still keeping Mark Andrews unless they get the perfect deal because they don't have 100% confidence. They want something to truly supplement if they're getting rid of Andrews because they feel Andrews is definitely better than Likely. That's Ricky's 2 cents. Some people like Fannin a lot more than me. Sorry, I don't. Jalen Lane, Debo ahead of him. Can he even beat out Luke McCaffrey, quite frankly? Um, yes, Kingsbury can scheme him up, but he's one of these 5'9", 191 guys, that 191-pound guys that I'm just not a big fan of, particularly those that are drafted much later in the draft, not a round 1 or round 2 type or early round 3. So Lane much deeper down the list. Similar, Ty Felton, last pick of round 3 to Minnesota. Great speed, great separation. He is 6'1", but he's immediately 183 pounds. Okay, he can do some kick returning stuff as well. I don't see him this year even as the number 3. Jalen Naylor, they really like him in Minnesota. So Jefferson, which right there doesn't leave a lot. Then you got Addison. Throw in Hawkinson as a tight end. Then you have Naylor as number 3, and then you have Jalen Lane. Just don't see him getting any playing time soon. If you have kick return leagues, and with them expecting to now have 75% of kick returns actually returned, he could be interesting from that regard. Savion Williams, I loved him. For those that may recall, that listened to my previous podcast, I loved him as a sleeper, really, really did. Unfortunately, landed with the Packers. who I don't think are going to give him snaps as a running back, which is I really loved watching him those few snaps that he did play at running back, and he is 6'4", so he's not going to get tons of snaps behind, particularly with Josh Jacobs, Marshawn Lloyd, et cetera, in front of him. Not to mention, I'll go ahead and mention Emmanuel Willis and Chris Brooks that they like as well. So that's part one. Then, I talked about it when I talked about Matthew Golden, all the receivers, all the tight ends. Now, past 2 years from now, maybe there's opportunity if they don't, if they let the Dobbs and the Reeds and Watsons and so forth all go into free agency and Savion Williams continues to develop, or Savion Williams, depending on how you pronounce it. If they let all those guys go and Williams does develop from a pass catching perspective, yes, absolutely, there's potential, but that's in the 3+ year range. I like to look within 2 years, so that's why I have him all the way down here. Once again, he could get some kick returning opportunities. So if you have big kick return points in your league, there is an opportunity there. Lastly, Torrey Horton, another player I know people have higher. And yes, I know he is a bigger wide receiver, which I do tend to like from a height perspective, but his weight is a little bit on the lighter side for his height. He'll definitely be behind MVS. He'll be definitely be behind Cooper Kupp and JSN for snaps. On top of that, as I talked about with Elijah Arroyo, does Arroyo kind of play an X big tight end along with, you got Noah Fant out there. You have Arroyo as well. It could look like a 2 tight end, but they're using him as an X and send him deep. Torrey Horton is at best probably a number 5 wide receiver this year, with Arroyo kind of counting as that number 4. And they still have Jake Bobo, who they liked as well, although he's a slower big wide receiver. So that's why I have Hart way over here. He wasn't exactly a top 3-round draft pick and all. Talked earlier about how the success rates of becoming a top 36 receiver and above for multiple years is very low for rounds 4 through 7. That's why I have Hart here so low. Let's move to tier 22, and I have a bunch of linebackers here at tier 22. And here's what I'm going to say about the linebackers. I'm not going to talk about each one of them. These are the shot in the dark linebackers where patience is required. They could be a number 2 or number 3 linebacker a year from now, but probably not likely. Not holding my breath for any of these folks other than from a special teams perspective. A lot of these folks, once again, there is such a run on linebackers, much faster than expected, pulled a lot of these guys up much higher than they should have been. There's a lot of people in front of all these folks from a depth chart perspective. I just don't see it. There are some possibilities. TJ Edwards was signed to a 2-year extension with the Bears. They haven't done that for Tremaine Edmonds yet. I believe this is Edmonds last year. Could Ruben Hippolyte replace Edmonds? Maybe. Could I see him going after a free agent or a higher linebacker or better linebacker next year in the draft? Yeah, I could. So a lot of these guys, I just see them on special teams covering kicks and punts, folks. And so that's it for tier 22. We are going to move on. Oh, and if you're listening, let me just mention the names: Barrett Carter, Ruben Hippolyte, Jeffrey Bassa, Shamar James, Colin Oliver, Smail Munden, Francisco Mwaga with the Jets. Tier 23 running backs. This is what I call the late round running backs, where the NFL usually knows better than we do, but we think we know more oftentimes than them. And even though they're drafted in the 7th round, there's a small chance for a few of these folks. Okay. Damian Martinez, probably number 4 in the depth chart, even behind Kenny McIntosh, but Kenneth Walker is a free agent. Good, strong 2-down back. Not bad in pass blocking, but he's number 4. Kyle Monangai, Rutgers. Look, he could be the number 3 running back. Do I think a 7th round running back is really going to leapfrog DeAndre Swift or Roshan Johnson? No. Do I think Chicago ultimately signs another free agent running back? Yes, I do. So that's it. Ollie Gardner in Miami. Okay, he's not the speedsters that your Devin Achane, your Jalen Wright, are. So he's a different type of back. So he's like a Jordan Howard light for those that remember Jordan Howard, but I don't think he has a year or two like Jordan Howard has. Maybe he makes a team as a short yardage back. Maybe he gets to play some special teams, but not much more than that. Phil Maffa, yeah, he played hurt last year at Clemson. Yes, he's 230 pounds back. He's the opposite of the Jade Blue, who's too small. This guy's too big, didn't have a ton of wiggle. Um, yes, he was strong. Yes, you can give him 30 carries, all that kind of stuff, but I just don't see it with him. This is my sleeper, as I joke about, like like I'm some sort of scout or whatever. But just there's something about this guy that I really liked. But he was a seventh rounder. But even though I like him, he's way down in my tier 23. Okay, so I'm not exactly going to pick him early, and I might be scooping him up as a free agent after my rookie draft. But Ja'Cory Krosky Merritt, really, really loved what I saw of him at the Senior Bowl and some of the highlights that I watched of him from his New Mexico time. So he is my sleeper. And at Washington, you have Brian Robinson Jr., who does nothing special. He's solid, not spectacular. Austin Eckler, last year of a contract, was also 30. Then you have Jeremy McNichols and Chris Rodriguez, who was on the practice squad. That's his competition. There's a chance, granted, lots of players in front of him, but there's a chance that is my guy. Okay, if I'm going to call one, that's it. Okay, let's move to tier 24. Safeties who could be starting a year from now with IDP value. And by the way, you notice Andrew Makuba is not on this list. And the reason he's not is because of Vic Fangio's system in Philadelphia, where they play a lot of two deep safeties. That's what hurt Blankenship last year from IDP. Yes, he did get a few picks that occasionally helped him. But in general, his tackles were down. Same with Chauncey Gardner-Johnson Jr. They prevent the big plays, hurts their IDP stats. Giannis Sanker, 4'4", 40, 6 foot, 206 pounds, strong tackler. Once again, the Saints are putting emphasis on people who can tackle. Um, he is going to be behind Justin Reed and Tyrann Mathieu this year. Next year, I believe Matthew's gone, and he replaces Mathieu at the safety position. Okay, 205 tackles the last 2 years, over 100 tackles each of the last 2 years. Crazy. Plus 12 and a half tackles for loss, plus 16 pass defenses, plus 2 sacks and 3 forced fumbles. He is more of a box safety, which huge upside from an IDP perspective. Would like to see more interceptions. Would like to see more pass defense. He is more of a box safety. He could be more of a number 3 linebacker, play that same linebacker role as well. And so love him for the future, not for this year. Craig Woodson with New England. Another one ran a 4.45 40. He's 6 foot, 200 pounds. Now, this is over the last 3 years, so that's about 70 some tackles a year, but he had 226 tackles in the last 3 years, 19 pass defenses, and 5 interceptions. There are some concerns about how well he can do in pass coverage, though, despite those kind of stats on the pass defense and interceptions and all. But he was a 4th-round pick. He has Kyle Duggar ahead of him, who I expect to stay as starting safety with the Patriots. This year, the Patriots also have Jabril Peppers. They signed Marcus Epps in free agency. Did I say Preppers instead of Peppers? Sorry, Jabril Peppers, Marcus Epps, who they signed in free agency, who is coming off an injury though, and then possibly Marte Mapu, who I'll be really curious to see. My gut says New England's going to move Mapu to a linebacker spot. Okay, so but he's got at least probably 3 people ahead of him this year. I believe Peppers and Epps are going next year. Duggar and Woodson are your starting safeties in year 2. Marcus Siegel with San Francisco is next on the list. He's only 5'11", but he ran a 4.37 40. There is talk of him potentially playing in the slot as well. I don't see that, particularly with them drafting Upton Stout. We'll talk about Stout in a second. But once again, in the last 2 years, someone who's willing to tackle, he had 124 tackles. So on average over 60 years, he had 16 pass defenses, 4 interceptions. Adding to the intrigue in San Francisco is word came out that Malik Mustafa had an ACL injury in Week 18, won't be ready for Week 1 this year. Probably is available Week 8, Week 9, Week 10, somewhere around those lines. It'll be real interesting to see where San Francisco's bye falls this year. Their bye week falls and when Mustafa might come back coming out of that. But now that explains why they signed both Jason Pinnock from the New York Giants and Richie Grant from Atlanta. Jair Brown did also struggle with San Francisco last year when he did play. So, and he's the one that went to the bench, not Mustafa, when Hufanga came back from his injury, which was very, very surprising to me. So how do I think this plays out? I do think Pinnock and Brown do end up starting the year. depending on if Mustafa can come back next year, then I think he will roll in for Brown next year. If Mustafa doesn't come back or struggling as he comes back, as the year progresses, I can see Pinnock and Siegel being your starting safeties at San Francisco. Richie Grant could be in the mix. He was a former number two, but the fact that the Falcons went in, even though Grant was a number two second round draft pick, sorry to clarify, and they signed Jesse Bates in free agency. They signed Justin Simmons. They were looking to replace him. He even shared time with DeMarco Helms before those guys came along. That tells me that Grant is probably a special teamer and not necessarily a starting safety. So that's how I see it for Siegel. So he's out of these three, the one that has the best chance of potentially playing this year, but I think it's slim this year, better chance in year two. All right, my bonus tier, my last tier, tier 25. These are cornerbacks that have the potential to play slot. Notice I haven't talked about any cornerbacks because cornerbacks usually the repeat rate is 3 of the top 12 repeat every year, 6 of the top 24. There's very few Kenny Moores. There's very few Teron Johnsons. Okay, and even Kenny Moore getting up in there in age that are on the field 100% of the snaps. In Johnson's situation, they're almost always with at least three cornerbacks on the field. Kenny Moore has been playing on the boundary, and then when they went to three cornerbacks, he moved inside. That's what gave him his value. There's not a whole lot of those folks. These folks all have a chance to get significant playing time in the slot. J.D. Barron in particular could be like the Kenny Moore that I just described, starting out as a boundary cornerback, and when they go to three corners, moving into the slot. And he has the chance to create turnovers from that position. He has a chance to create slots from that position being the slot side of things. And so I think that creates opportunity, a big opportunity for him because he could play 100% of the snaps. So that's why I have him in my bonus tier. And let me scroll up so you can see the names for those that are watching. The other thing on Barron is that maybe, just maybe, they aren't as happy as Brandon Jones, and in addition to signing Hufanga, maybe Barron plays more of a safety role instead. Which, if he has cornerback eligibility playing safety, that could be a really good thing as well. So Barron is one. While I typically don't draft any cornerbacks early, he is the one, and I call it a bonus tier because this is cornerbacks, and your scoring systems have a big impact on this. But he's the one on this list that, depending on your scoring system, could move way up on the list. Okay, three more: Jacob Parrish at Tampa Bay, Quincy Riley, New Orleans, Caleb Ransaw in Jacksonville, and if you want to have player number 102, Upton Stout from San Francisco, who has a chance to start in the slot at San Francisco. I don't have him on this list typed up that you're seeing on the screen, but he's one that could play 80% of the snaps in the 80% of the snaps in the slot. Boy, I couldn't get that out for some reason. When they play teams that play a lot of three wide receiver sets. The same for Jacob Parrish, same for Quincy Riley, same for Caleb Ransaw. All those three have great speed. All of them probably primarily slot cornerbacks. Okay. We're at the 2 hour and 13-minute mark. So we are done with now 24 tiers and the bonus 25th tier. So that's Ricky Rod's post NFL draft Dynasty Offense and IDP rookie draft tier board. I hope you learned a lot from it. I hope you didn't check out and give up on me. If you're listening to this, if you're jumping around hearing this now, I hope you'll come back and listen to the parts you missed because I think there's a whole lot to learn from it. Okay. Upcoming shows. We're going to do a post NFL draft veteran winners and losers. So we will be talking about the impacts of some of these rookies and what it means for veterans, and who will be displaced and who probably won't be displaced, at least in the coming year or maybe in the second year. Then from there, we'll talk about with Sean Teague at Sean8386, who joined me for a lot of the short start sit shows that we did at IDP Plus. You'll hear us talking about the top 24 at each position, who's going to jump into the top 24, who we think is going to fall out of the top 24. Those are going to be some great shows to watch as well. If you like this show, please give me a thumbs up on YouTube. If you have comments or questions, suggestions, please add that to the YouTube IDP Plus channel on this show, on this IDP Plus advice show. Would really appreciate that. Please give me a follow at RickyRod66 on X as well. If once again you were listening and didn't get to see it, you can go from Spotify to the YouTube channel and watch the Excel tiers that typed up, and so that you can see them and copy them if you would like. Okay, with that, don't forget about Fast Draft app. Don't forget about idpplus.com special, IDP 2025 to save you 50%. Don't forget to sign up for the Fantasy Football Expo, or at least check it out if you've never been. It's awesome. With that, we'll see you in about another week or so. This is Ricky Rodrigue wishing you, your family, and your friends great health and happiness. Be kind to one another. I'm out of here, finally, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you for watching the IDP Plus YouTube network. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to tap the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.